It's a great pleasure to be here, and I've really enjoyed the presentation so far, and I was really disappointed to hear that Stefan wasn't coming to speak today. I wish him well. The book is fantastic. I confess I haven't finished it yet, but I have started it, and I recommend it to all of you. And I was looking forward to also to hearing how impudent I am, because I'm going to talk about quantification. I'm a neuroscientist, so the approach to Baukultur that you'll hear from me is, I guess I would say, uniquely biological and neuroscientific. And so here's the outline. I want to talk about this, first of all, this question of whether there are universal principles of good design. And the answer, as I've indicated here, is both yes and no, which is not all that surprising. I want to talk also about the impulse to measure, some of the methods that I've used for measurement, and what do those measures tell us. And then finally, I want to end with some, from the standpoint of neuroscience, some somewhat scattered and disappointing reflections on culture. As you'll see, disappointing only with respect to the fact that quantifying cultural variables is much more difficult than quantifying some of the other things that I'll describe to you. So first of all, are there principles of design? I want to give kind of a historical perspective according to the way that environmental psychologists and neuroscientists see the world, and there are all kinds of different places where one could start the story. But I thought it would be useful to start with the work of a geographer named J. Appleton, who wrote a really influential book called The Experience of Landscape that you see here. And what he tried to do in the book was to give an account of landscape aesthetic and landscape preference based on a number of sources of information. One of the things he looked at, for example, was the work of really good landscape architects like Capability Brown. And here's one of the crowning glories of. Okay, so J. Appleton, landscape architect, he looked at different kinds of evidence. Some of the evidence came from the work of landscape architects. Some other approaches came from examination of landscape painting. And the question for Appleton was, can we identify universal aspects of landscape that most people seem to like from these kinds of pieces of evidence? And he said, to his eye, it looked as though it was mostly about these things: elevation and water, and also this curious duality of things called prospect and refuge, where prospect, as I've said here, represents information, our ability to be able to capture information from what we see, and refuge has to do with protection. So Appleton here was making a shift to something, again, inherently biological, because his inspiration for that duality of prospect and refuge came from biologists who argued that in habitat selection, one of the key principles for an animal was to find locations from which it could see and not be seen. So prospect and refuge was, for human beings, the analog to that. And if you look carefully, and I'm sure that a specialist audience like this already has watched people a lot in all kinds of settings, and you've noticed probably the action of prospect and refuge in play in places like public squares, in even restaurants and bars, where we have a tendency to want to inhabit the edges rather than the center of such spaces. And again, Appleton argued that the reason for this was inherently biological. There's also, here's a very controversial figure, Edward Wilson, who wrote a book which is related to these kinds of biological approaches to the world. The book was called Sociobiology. And in that book, Wilson argued basically that lots of things that we might think of as being not really all that biological, in fact, were branches of biology. So he would describe me as a biologist. He would describe sociology as well as really being a branch of biology. And the main argument was that one could almost always, or in Wilson's view, probably always, find a biological explanation for the phenomena of human nature and human interactions. So lots of people kind of picked up on this idea in evolutionary psychology and argued that one way to understand at least what we like, if maybe not what we love, but we'll get to that point, was to think of the human being and the human brain in particular as being something that was adapted to live in a particular kind of setting, like, for example, this setting in the Serengeti, where we argue that all people may have come from. So there were even people who said that our preferences for things like the silhouettes of trees were related to the silhouettes of, I think I have an acacia tree, I do, were related to the acacia trees that one could find in those kinds of settings. So we tend to like the kinds of tree shapes that have low-lying branches that spread out for a long way. And people in Wilson's camp argued that the reason for this had to do, again, with our biological lineage. In more recent times, there has been in environmental psychology a huge amount of attention paid to the effects of exposure to natural settings. So what you're looking at here is actually an experiment that, and there are many experiments like this done in the field, done in laboratories, where people are placed into natural settings and we very carefully measure their brains and their bodies. And the argument is, and it's a good argument because there's tons of evidence to back this up, that when people are placed in such settings, they produce what's called a restorative response. And that has all kinds of manifestations in our bodily physiology, in our hormonal state. Oliver spoke this morning about the 8-second attention span of modern human beings. You can increase that attention span with a relatively brief exposure to a natural setting. It's been shown in lots of different kinds of experiments. So one of the tools that I use is I use a lot of wearables. I use a device that measures levels of physiological arousal. So I'm interested in essentially how excited or otherwise you become by being presented with different kinds of settings. And the methodology, I won't belabor the details, but essentially what we're measuring is the response of people's sweat glands to different kinds of settings. And what you're looking at here is actually a map. It's a part of New York City. The blue curtains that you can see in the map represent the average level of arousal of a group of people walking through the city. And presumably those levels wax and wane in accord with the things that they see and experience during that walk. So one thing of note might be that if you look near the bottom, you'll see that when people are in this green area, which was actually a community garden, their levels of physiological arousal were quite low. I can feel my ears falling off yet again. Let's see how we go. I want to show you another. So first of all, the idea is that our levels of arousal will change as we experience the world, and they'll change presumably with the properties of the design of, in this case, a streetscape. So I want to talk a little bit more about different kinds of streetscapes, and in particular the facades of buildings. Here's one kind of streetscape, here's another kind of streetscape. You probably have preferences for one as opposed to the other, and some of those preferences, I would argue, have to do with the amount of information that's available to you on the street. So again, using, this is irritating. Using the kinds of tools that I described to you before, here, this is completely staged. These are people who work in my lab, and you can see that they're not playing Pokemon Go. They're actually answering questions on phone apps, and they're also wearing pieces of gear. You can see headbands that are measuring brain waves, and in some cases, we have people again wear the bands that indicate arousal levels. And so one of the things that we've done is to take people into different kinds of settings and to measure, again, physiological arousal. This is an example of a couple of what we've called closed facades. We've done this in different cities throughout the world. Help is at hand. Yes. All right, so one of the things, as I said, we've done is to look at different kinds of streetscapes, and especially to look at the amount of information that's available to people on the street. And what you're looking at here is a couple of what we would call closed facades. The left is New York, the right is a restaurant in Berlin. We've done this kind of work in other settings as well. We've compared people's responses to the kinds of settings that I just showed you with higher complexity settings like the one that I just showed you in the streetscape from Copenhagen. And when we measure the body, that is, when we measure arousal levels, what we find is that people's arousal levels go low compared to baseline in those low complexity or closed facades, and go up in the case of high complexity facades. That by itself is not enough to tell us what's going on with people, because as everybody here knows, you can be in a state of high arousal for both good and bad reasons, and the same with a state of low arousal. If you're in a nice green space and your arousal level is low, that's not a bad thing. In this case, people in the closed facade condition had not only low levels of arousal, but they felt bad. They didn't want to be where they were. You don't need to ask them to know this. You can read it from their posture, and even from things like their walking speed. So that combination of feeling bad, having low levels of emotion, negative emotion, and low levels of arousal is the absolute signature for boredom. In other kinds of domains, when people experience low affect, as we call it, or low emotion and low arousal, we know that they're bored. And boredom is generally a bad thing. Boredom is stressful, as again, everyone here I'm sure knows. Boredom causes the secretion of stress hormones, cortisol, for example, and causes other kinds of changes in the body that over the long term would be expected to lead to disease, things like metabolic disorders and cardiac disease. So I've been accused of saying, and this is not quite right, but some people have said, are you really telling me that if you experience a piece of a boring city, you're going to drop dead of a heart attack? Well, not quite. But nevertheless, I think that there's an argument to be made that there's actually a public health impact of good versus poor urban design, that building streetscapes that have low levels of attraction, interest, information, or in a slightly different turn of phrase, one might say Baukultur, although it's a little bit different, these bad streetscapes will shorten your life. And here are a couple of examples of, it's hard to think of this as being inherently bad, but it's kind of isolated. Here's a nice blank facade and a couple of facades that are not blank at all. Okay, so I had to show this because we're in Switzerland, and I just wanted to, at this point, say, we know some of these things, and yet perhaps through a somewhat of a misapplication of some of the ideas of Le Corbusier and others, we build things like these things, and we do this all over the world. And in fairness, I've shown you a badly scaled, inhuman high-rise settlement from Canada. We do it too. Here's Brasilia. We won't bother with the bad entryway for now. But the basic idea is that we build badly all over the place. We build badly for some of the reasons that have already been discussed today. We build for economics. We build for efficiency, but we don't necessarily build for human beings. And using some of the tools that I've described, we know some things about how to do that. Okay, so here's another kind of approach. I'm very interested in biomimetic design, which basically just means designing built things that in some way or another resemble things from nature. And although he didn't always describe his work in exactly this way, Christopher Alexander, the architectural theoretician, was very much an advocate of, and his group was very much advocates of biomimetic design. So we won't go through all of these fundamental properties, thank goodness, but Alexander was a great fan of describing the key properties that he thought went into successful designs. In many cases without really very much empirical evidence, but with just some discussion and gut feeling. But in those cases where we do have empirical evidence, it turns out that Alexander was not too far off of the mark in terms of being able to characterize what might make human beings feel good, what might lead us to build settings that at least we like, if not love. And so here are some examples. Well, we didn't build the fern, but the other structures that you see in this slide are things that human beings have built. And the reason that the fern is there is because what all of these structures and others have in common is that they exhibit what's called self-similarity. That is, They have repeating designs at a number of different scales, and that's also something that we see in great abundance in scenes of nature. And one argument is that the reason why we groove to nature, the reason why we have that restorative response has to do maybe with the fractal structure of scenes of nature. And the evidence here suggests that maybe if that's duplicated in built designs, we can see some of the same kinds of beneficial effects. Okay, and it turns out that I had to show a picture of a brain to prove that I actually am a neuroscientist. It turns out that we have a piece of brain that is specialized for processing information from scenes. You're looking at it here on the left side. The upper left side of the slide shows a very schematized brain map. That's the underside of your brain. You have something called the parahippocampal place area, the name of which is much less important than what it actually does, which it processes is that it processes information from scenes, and it really likes scenes of nature, and it really likes scenes that have fractal structure. And that part of the brain, as it turns out, the reason that I have those highlighted cells on the right side of the slide is to remind me to tell you that that part of the brain also has abundant numbers of opiate receptors. So most people have heard of this idea that we have naturally occurring opiate systems in our brains that are part of the mechanism of reward systems for various kinds of motivators like food and sex. Well, it turns out that we may have the same kind of system in this part of the brain, which here may be specialized for drawing us towards attractive scenes with fractal structure, which in the unbuilt world would normally come from nature. So we have some ideas about what the universal properties might be of things in places that human beings like. And there's some evidence that they might even have some universality to them. Most people, it seems, like at least some of the things, if not all of the things that Christopher Alexander and people like him have identified. Things like fractality, curvature, symmetry, for example, all tend to tickle us in positive ways when we see them in built designs. So what about culture? Well, here's the sad part of the story. Cognitive neuroscientists can't tell you very much about the influence of culture on our liking for places. And I think that's key and unfortunate because I think that distinction between liking and loving comes when you add cultural variables to the mix. So here's one of the reasons why we don't know very much about culture. That is because the list of things that I've shown you here is the list of attributes for almost all of the research that's done in environmental psychology. That is the attributes of the participants, the people who are studied. They're Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. So though I may not have a whoop, I do have a weird. Most research on the human response to environments comes from weird samples like this. There simply has not been enough attention paid to the impact of cultural heterogeneity. And I think one of the reasons is pragmatics. It's really easy to get vast samples of first or second year undergraduate university students, most of whom, as we all know, are weird. It's also simply for the matter of not having looked hard enough for the right things. A couple of little signposts. The woman that I'm showing in this slide is one of my grad students, Hannah Nagami, and she has done some really nice research on the architecture of awe. So the idea is to ask what kinds of features in the built environment might cause us to feel awe. So to back up for a second, why would we even care about that? Why is awe important? Well, if you don't know already, I'll tell you, awe is important because it actually changes who you are. When you experience awe, it changes the way that you behave. People who've experienced a state of awe are more pro-social. They're more philanthropic. They are friendlier towards one another, more likely to offer help to a stranger. So understanding, so this is why Hannah's interested in awe, because understanding where awe comes from in a building might be a very interesting way of understanding how buildings can transform behavior and maybe pull us towards some of those goals that you heard this morning as being stated as the very definition of high-quality Baukultur. So what Hannah has done is compared people's responses to settings like these, and this actually was the most awe-inspiring scene from all of the views that she showed, to settings like this, which was the least awe-inspiring in our set. And what Hannah did basically was to extract from her sample of images the features that seemed to be driving the experience of awe. And here's what she came up with. No huge surprises here, I don't think. Immensity is important. We experience awe in large settings as measured with a number of different variables. Light, natural light, windows are important, and also adornment, things like the age, imagery, arches, and ornament in a building. And I think adornment is especially interesting with respect to cultural variables, because I think that if you stretch the definition of what we mean by adornment a little bit beyond, and only a little bit beyond the list of items that you see in this description, you can see that time is involved here. And there was some discussion this morning about the fact that culture takes time to develop, and of course it does. So physical variables in a building that are suggestive of the passage of time, that are suggestive of having reached across a very long period of time to get to you in the present moment, seem as though they may drive the emotion of awe. So just as the immensity of space might produce awe, also the immensity of time might as well. In research that I've done, there have been sometimes subtle suggestions of the impact of culture. The reason that I'm showing these two images is that each of them comes from walks that I've conducted in different cities. Again, the left side is New York City, the right side is Berlin. And both of these cases were cases where we had surprises. In both of these cases, going into our studies, we predicted that people would respond negatively to both of these images. Especially the image on the left, where you can see, if you look closely, first of all, it's dead flat, boring, but it even is hostile. If you look closely at the design of the fence, there's some hostile architecture there designed to prevent people from sitting on it. Nevertheless, people who were presented with this taken to this location, by and large, reported positive responses. And interestingly enough, that was only the case when we tested people who lived in the vicinity of that location. And I'll tell you what it is. It's an affordable housing complex in New York City. And the reason we think that the local people responded positively is because they knew the history of that complex. They knew the families who'd lived there, some of whom had lived there for a very long time. They responded to everything positive that they could find in that image, and didn't even seem as though they could see the things that to a naive eye we might respond to negatively. The same thing with the structure on the right. This is a squatter house in Berlin. To an outsider who knows nothing about Berlin, such as me when I arrived to do this experiment, one might imagine that a viewer would receive that scene with disfavor, if not a little bit of fear. And the history of Berlin is such that these squatter houses have been the kind of culturally iconic. They're locations of dissent and sometimes even art colonies. Okay, so where do I go from here? So we have some patchwork understanding that just as everybody here knows that culture is important, cognitive neuroscientists have little bits and pieces of evidence to suggest that culture can overturn some of those relatively universal principles of good design. When we understand the setting that we're in, and when we've experienced that setting through time, sometimes that changes the way that we see the raw physical parameters of place. The last couple of things I wanted to mention, first of all, is this idea of Bau without Kultur. So I actually first heard this idea from Rem Koolhaas, who I think he's changed his mind about this now, but at one point he was writing about what he called the generic city. And the argument was that we should build cities like airports so that everybody knows where everything is, and remove all cultural artifacts as much as we can from a city. The idea being that for someone who's not from the culture of the city, let's say an immigrant who moves to a setting, those cultural icons might be oppressive, so we should just get rid of them. So it is possible, I think. Well, is it possible to do that? Maybe, maybe not. Is it a good idea? Almost certainly not. The last point I wanted to make is Bau becoming Baukultur, and I've got a couple of images of buildings here. Both of these, by the way, are biomimetic structures. One designed in the form of a kind of sea sponge, and the other one designed in the form of a femur. And they are little pieces of evidence that how a structure, so there are these universal properties of structures that might or might not make them appeal to us. And then there's what happens to structures as they enter culture over time. So you probably know that the Eiffel Tower for some time was vilified, that there were lots of people who hoped that it was only there temporarily and will be taken down when the exhibition was ended. The negative response to what's sometimes still called the gherkin, although it's not really very gherkin-like in London, was not quite as strong, but nevertheless there were critics. And over time, what's happened in both of these cases is that these sites have become more or less revered sites of iconic cultural sites. In fact, I believe that there is now protection in law for views of the gherkin from different places in London. This is, to summarize, basically the story is that I think we have some idea of how to build places that we like based on the principles of biomimetic structure, some of the ideas that I presented to you today. We know much less about how culture has an impact. It seems easily possible that both of these things can be managed together. And I put this slide up just because it's a favorite building of a colleague of mine named Michael Arbib, who has suddenly, for reasons I can't imagine, become really interested in Baukultur. He likes this building, he tells me, because it's in Singapore. The building has references to local culture. So, for example, it has a hawker market in the building, which is a very important culturally significant site. But at the same time, it has lots of biomimetic design. You can see that there's abundant nature in the setting itself. And by all accounts, I don't know whether this has been studied formally yet, but by all accounts, this seems to be a very successful building that manages to combine some of those some of those universal principles along with cultural references. And that's the end of my story, that these biomimetic design elements that I talked a bit about seem to have more or less universal appeal. We don't know nearly as much as we should know about the influence of culture, in part because of weird practices. We do know that culture and memory can overlay those universal design elements, as I've seen from a couple of examples in my own work. The end. Thank you.